January 1943, 0140 hours, above a moonless North Sea off the Dutch coast. The Heinkel, He-111s and Dornier Do-217s ran west in cold, steady air, their exhausts faint orange beads in the slipstream and the smell of hot glycol drifting through unheated fuselages. Behind them the Ruhr lay blacked out. Ahead, England was only a compass bearing and the fading flame trails of the formation leader. Crews whispered that clouds and darkness were armor enough. Then, without warning, cones of white speared the night. Searchlights fixed, not groping, locked so precisely that gunners felt the beams bite the skin of their aircraft. A wireless operator later wrote that the flak which followed walked toward us like someone who already knew our stride, and in seconds the sky filled with timed bursts from 3.7-inch guns. From above and astern something else arrived, twin-engined shapes sliding out of the black, guns already aligned, attacking by numbers as if guided by an unseen hand. The shock spread down the stream. Intercoms filled with clipped calls and the hoarse breathing of men who could not understand how they had been found. Some jettisoned bombs into the sea, others dived, certain the beams would lose them. They did not know that on the English coast, tall lattice towers had seen them minutes earlier at over 100 miles, that ground-controlled interception plots were feeding bearing and height to night fighter crews, and that airborne sets would take those fighters the last few miles in. The bombers pressed on because they had trained to, but the old rule darkness meant safety had broken. Britain's invisible network had turned night into a battlefield of measured angles and echoes, and the men at its heart were only now starting to reveal what it could do. Next we turned to the system that made those impossible interceptions routine. Autumn 1940. The skies above Britain burned in rhythms of thunder. The Luftwaffe's bombers, hundreds strong, crossed the Channel nightly in waves that turned London, Coventry and Liverpool into maps of flame. The German crews flew by stopwatch and instinct, trusting that the shroud of night would hide their approach. Below them, the British response was desperate improvisation, columns of searchlights clawing upward, acoustic mirrors straining to catch an echo of approaching engines, and gunners firing blind into the dark. Each flash of flak lit up a scene of confusion. Aircraft circling without bearings, defenders deafened by their own guns, and civilians huddled in shelters that trembled under impact. For months, the Blitz was terror and guesswork measured only by survival. By 1941, it was clear that both attacker and defender were fighting half-blind. The night sky was no longer a battlefield, it was a void. German navigators used radio beacons and dead reckoning to find their targets, while British pilots scrambled into darkness, guided only by sector control and luck. For Fighter Command, the failure to intercept consistently was intolerable. The Air Ministry turned to scientists, demanding a way to see without light. At the Telecommunications Research Establishment in Dorset, physicists like Sir Robert Watson-Watt and Edward Bowen began to refine an experimental system first used against daylight raids, radar. The chain home stations, once limited to coastal detection, were extended inland and refined to track aircraft across the North Sea and deep over the continent. Slowly, precision replaced chance. As the Blitz faded and the bombers returned to France and Germany, British scientists knew the next wave would come under the same cover of darkness. But this time Britain would not rely on faith or fortune. The invisible architecture rising along its shores promised to make darkness a weapon of defense, not concealment. The struggle for the night skies had begun to shift, from bravery to calculation, from chaos to control, and soon the hunters would find themselves hunted. February 1935, Daventry, England. In a frozen field near a BBC transmitter, a team of engineers waited beside a wooden van filled with oscilloscopes and humming equipment. As a biplane flew overhead, faint pulses flickered across the screens, proof that invisible radio waves could detect an aircraft at distance. Sir Robert Watson-Watt and his colleague Arnold Skip Wilkins had achieved the impossible. What began as a simple experiment to counter supposed death rays became something far greater, the birth of radar. Within months, Britain's Air Ministry seized upon the discovery, ordering the creation of a coastal early warning network. Along the eastern and southern shores rose the towers of Chain Home, steel-latticed giants over 60 meters high, transmitting on frequencies between 20 and 30 MHz. Each station could detect formations more than 100 miles away, mapping the sky in real time and feeding positions to the Royal Air Force's filter rooms, where controllers plotted raids and scrambled fighters with unprecedented precision. When the Battle of Britain raged through the summer of 1940, those towers became the silent sentinels of survival. Radar allowed the RAF to meet the Luftwaffe's waves, not with guesswork but with direction, conserving precious fuel and men. Yet even as daylight raids fell to this new shield, the night war presented a darker challenge. Echoes blurred, signals faded, and the enemy vanished into static. The scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment refused to yield. Their solution was revolutionary: take radar into the air itself. By late 1940, Bristol Beaufighters fitted with airborne interception Mach-4 radar began to prowl the black skies. Their spinning aerial arrays could locate enemy bombers within 4 miles, turning invisible duels into measured hunts. To the German crews who had once trusted the darkness, destruction now came unseen, from aircraft guided not by eyes, but by echoes. Britain's miracle of defense had evolved into a weapon of pursuit, and before long, the hunters of the Reich would discover that even the night could betray them. March 1941, over the blackened Midlands, the bombers of Kampfgeschwader 55 returned from another raid on Coventry. Frost rimed their perspex canopies, and the moon was hidden behind thick English cloud. For the Luftwaffe, this was supposed to be safety. Yet tonight the flak had been different, eerily precise. Gunners below seemed to know exactly where the formations were, even before the engines could be heard. Shells burst at perfect altitude, walking through the air in disciplined rhythm. Over the intercoms, crews spoke in disbelief. How could the British see them in such darkness? When they reached their bases in occupied France, many carried the same story: defenses that fired without warning, searchlights that locked instantly, and fighters that appeared out of nowhere, striking from behind as if summoned by the night itself. Those interceptors were Bristol Beaufighters and, soon after, sleek de Havilland Mosquitoes fitted with airborne interception radar. Each carried the new Mach-4 set, with twin aerials jutting from the nose, able to pick up the faint reflection of a bomber 4 miles away. But the brilliance of the system lay beneath the ground, in the dark, sealed bunkers of Britain's ground-controlled interception network. Inside, radar operators stared at phosphorescent cathode screens, where each aircraft appeared as a pulsing green dot. Controllers spoke calmly into headsets, vectoring night fighter pilots by bearing and altitude, guiding them until the enemy filled their radar scopes. Only then did the British aircraft switch to attack, unseen until the first burst of cannon fire tore through metal. By 1942, the statistics were unmistakable. A single RAF night fighter could down 2 or 3 bombers in one sortie. German intelligence, baffled, blamed undisciplined formations or mythical searchlight control. In Berlin, senior officers dismissed the reports as nervous exaggeration. But among the crews, a darker truth spread. Some invisible weapon was watching them, tracking every turn. One pilot later recalled, "It was as if the night itself had turned against us." That fear, silent and electric, began to haunt every cockpit that crossed the Channel. And it was only the beginning. By the winter of 1942, fear had taken on a phrase whispered in every Luftwaffe mess hall: Der englische Zauber, the English magic. Crews returning from missions to Birmingham, Manchester, and London no longer bragged about survival. They spoke in quiet disbelief. Entire squadrons had been trapped in flak patterns too perfect to be coincidence. British night fighters materialized with mechanical precision, always from the same blind spot, always at the same moment, as if reading their thoughts. At airfields from Lille to Bremen, ground crews began marking returning aircraft with chalk crosses for every missing companion. The boards filled faster each week. German intelligence tried to impose logic on the chaos. Field interrogations produced confused theories that the British used sound triangulation, secret beacons, or even trained bats. But when Allied broadcasts boasted of eyes that pierced the darkness, the rumors hardened into dread. Telefunken engineers were summoned to Berlin under urgent orders to uncover the truth. Their investigations revealed the nightmare was real. Britain had built a vast and coordinated radar defense grid, linking ground stations, searchlights, and airborne interceptors into a single killing web. Reports reaching Göring's staff described its precision as mathematisch tödlich, mathematically deadly. Panic drove desperate innovation. Crews were instructed to fly lower to hide beneath the radar horizon, to break formation before crossing the coast, and to scatter strips of metallic foil, codenamed Duppel, to confuse the tracking beams. But the measures came too late and too thin. The British adjusted frequencies, refined filtering, and continued their relentless watch. Each night brought new losses, sometimes whole flights vanishing without a trace. Morale collapsed. The Beaufighter earned a name spoken with bitterness and awe, Der flüsternde Tod, the whispering death. In the briefing huts, questions about how the English saw them gave way to silence. Darkness, once their shield, had become the enemy's greatest ally. The Luftwaffe was flying blind into a war it no longer understood. By 1943, Britain's defense of the night skies had evolved into something no other nation possessed, a perfectly synchronized machine of detection, calculation, and command. Beneath the rolling hills and coastal dunes of southern England, radar stations hummed through the night, their rotating aerials sweeping the skies with methodical rhythm. The echoes they caught, faint blips of returning energy, were converted into positions and altitudes, each plotted with care by the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. Inside vast, dimly lit operations rooms, WAF plotters moved colored markers across great horizontal maps, each representing a formation of enemy bombers or an orbiting RAF night fighter. Around them, duty officers and sector commanders issued clipped orders through headsets, merging data from dozens of sources into one living picture of the sky. From radar detection to interception, minutes passed, sometimes less. This was the heart of Britain's ground-controlled interception (GCI) system, a network that turned electronic echoes into lethal precision. The introduction of mobile EMS Type 7 and Type 8 radars extended that power even further, providing full coverage of southern England and the approaches to the Channel. Unlike earlier fixed towers, these new sets could track both enemy bombers and friendly fighters simultaneously, calculating courses with accuracy measured in hundreds of yards. Controllers sat before cathode screens glowing with phosphorescent green light, calling calm vectors to pilots of 85 and 96 squadrons circling in standby sectors. Turn 2 degrees right. Level at 9,000. The voices were steady, detached, mechanical, until a final tone signaled contact and the hunter descended into the dark. For the Luftwaffe crews, the results felt supernatural. Flak and fighters no longer appeared by luck. They arrived with certainty, as if each raid had been scripted in advance. Every crossing of the coast was now a fatal entry into an invisible grid where survival depended on seconds. The age of guesswork was over. Britain had achieved not just defense but orchestration, an empire of order in the chaos of war, and above that ordered realm, a new kind of weapon was preparing to take flight. Radar itself would soon become airborne, intelligent and everywhere. By 1943, the quiet miracle of radar had taken flight in the most unlikely form, a wooden aircraft that could outrun almost anything the enemy possessed. The de Havilland Mosquito NF McCann, light yet lethal, became the spearhead of Britain's nocturnal supremacy. Beneath its smooth plywood skin, it carried a weapon more powerful than any gun. The AI McBait radar, the first to use centimetric waves in the 3 GHz band. This breakthrough was made possible by the cavity magnetron, a British invention that compressed radar power into shorter wavelengths, allowing detection far beyond the reach of earlier sets and immune to the German Duppel chaff that once confused lower frequency systems. Now bombers that believed themselves invisible appeared as bright, distinct pulses on the Mosquito's cathode screen, each one a target already doomed. At 20,000 feet, Mosquito crews of No. 100 Group and other night fighter squadrons cruised silently through the darkness, engines barely audible to the men they hunted. Ground controllers guided them into contact zones. Then the radar operators took over, watching the small green trace tighten as range closed from 5 miles to 3 to 1. A short call, contact bearing 015, range 3 miles, and the pilot banked smoothly, unseen until the black outline of a Heinkel or Junkers filled the gun sight. In a burst of Hispano cannon fire, the night erupted in flame. Before the wreckage hit the earth, the Mosquito was already gone, vanishing back into the dark. The statistics were devastating. Intercept rates doubled within months. Luftwaffe night losses soared beyond replacement capacity, and morale began to crumble. Pilots flew scattered or turned back entirely, haunted by the knowledge that the enemy could find them anywhere, at any altitude. The Mosquito's combination of speed, silence, and radar vision turned the hunter's art into a science. Britain no longer merely defended its skies, it owned the night. What had begun as a shield against attack had become a blade of vengeance, striking and disappearing before dawn. By late 1942, the Luftwaffe's answer to the invisible threat had hardened into frantic engineering and field expedients. At first came detectors. Telefunken's FUG-350, nicknamed Naxos, was rushed into service to pick up the new centimetric emissions from British airborne sets. In theory, it offered warning, an ominous tone in the cockpit, a hint that a Mosquito or Beaufighter was closing. But in practice, Naxos was blunt and limited. It could tell crews they were being hunted, but not point the hunter out. Parallel to detection, German industry pressed its own airborne radar into service. Liechtenstein BC sets, soon followed by the longer wavelength SN2, were fitted into night fighters such as the Ju-88G and the Bf-110G, giving German crews a fragile chance to reacquire the initiative, and on some nights over the Ruhr, to bring RAF bombers down in turn. What unfolded was an invisible arms race conducted at the speed of radio waves. The Allies countered in kind and often faster. Massed strips of aluminium foil, known to the British as window and to German crews as Düppel, were dumped in clouds to produce acres of false echoes on radar screens, blinding the very chain home and GCI plots that had once guided interceptions. Electronic jammers such as Mandrel targeted German early warning frequencies, adding a layer of confusion that eroded the effectiveness of newly issued German sets. At the same time, Allied signals intelligence worked relentlessly. Decrypts and radio direction finding exposed German frequencies and operating procedures, allowing countermeasures to be tailored before a new German system could be fielded widely. Those technical duels were fought against a harsher reality. Germany's industrial roof could not flex indefinitely. Factories hit in night raids or by precision attacks lost production lines for radar valves, magnetrons, and aerial components, replacements that took months to rebuild. Every radar lost to bombing was a gap in the Luftwaffe's fragile recovery. Where engineers in Berlin improvised, Allied planners adapted, closing German avenues of escape almost as quickly as they opened them. Desperation drove doctrine, but desperation could not conjure the sustained output that a modern electronic war demanded. Thus the night steadily ossified in Britain's favor. The contest of receivers and jammers had run its course. The next phase would be less about hiding and more about punishment. Allied bomber streams, guided by the very science the Germans failed to master, preparing to strike in overwhelming waves. July 24, 1943, Hamburg, Germany. The night sky glowed red, then white, as if a second sun had risen over the North Sea. Operation Gomorrah had begun. More than 700 RAF bombers swept across the city in waves, guided not by stars or dead reckoning but by radar, specifically a new navigation system called H2S. From the navigator's seat, the ground below appeared as shifting shapes of light and shadow on a cathode ray screen, every river bend and harbor basin glowing in ghostly outline. It was radar's first great offensive act. The German defenders, blinded by the millions of metallic window strips scattered in the path of the bombers, fired blindly into the night. Below Hamburg's districts of Hammerbrook, Eilbeck and Hamm disintegrated in a firestorm that consumed over 40,000 lives in a week. For the first time in history, destruction was mapped and measured by radio waves. From that inferno forward, radar ceased to be merely a shield. It became the spearhead of Allied strategy. Britain's oboe system, a transponder-based rangefinder, could guide a bomber to within a few hundred meters of its mark. G, using synchronized ground pulses, allowed entire formations to navigate Europe's blackout with mathematical precision. These invisible tools transformed chaos into choreography. Crews could now strike through cloud, smoke, or darkness, reducing entire industrial centers to coordinates on a grid. By early 1944, the same technology that had burned Hamburg leveled Berlin, Nuremberg, and Munich in succession. Inside the Luftwaffe's control bunkers, operators stared at empty screens choked by jamming noise. Coordination collapsed. German pilots entered missions haunted by a paradox. They flew by radar and they died by radar. The psychological strain was visible. Trembling hands at briefing tables, talismans tucked into flight jackets, and whispered prayers before takeoff. In Berlin's air ministry, reports arrived without comment. The tone had shifted from strategy to resignation. What began as a miracle of British defense had become the very definition of modern war. Precision in darkness. And even as Europe burned, radar's horizon was already moving westward, toward the vast oceans where the next invisible battle would begin. By 1944, the invisible revolution born over Britain's coasts had crossed every ocean. Radar was no longer a secret, it was a doctrine. Across the Pacific, the United States Navy and Army Air Forces deployed it on a scale no enemy could match. Navy ships bristled with SG and CXAM radar sets, their rotating antennas scanning the horizon for echoes of ships and aircraft long before human eyes could glimpse them. In the vast night battles of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, American task forces opened fire at targets still beyond the visible line, salvos calculated from radar plots rather than telescopic sights. The results were devastating. Japanese formations broke apart before they even sighted the enemy. Destroyers and carriers fought by instrument alone, their gunnery and interception directed by glowing screens that turned chaos into geometry. In the air, the lessons of Britain's night defense reached their final perfection. B-24 Liberators and PBY Catalinas patrolled the Pacific, fitted with air-to-surface vessel, ASV radar, sweeping thousands of square miles of ocean. Where once darkness and cloud had offered sanctuary, now they betrayed. Japanese convoys found themselves attacked in moonless rain. Submarines that surfaced under overcast skies were discovered and destroyed within minutes. The same technology that had tracked Heinkels over the Channel now hunted steel shadows beneath the waves. German U-boat captains, thousands of miles away in the Atlantic, felt the same terror. ASV radar turned the night sea into daylight on Allied screens, and the death rate of submarines rose beyond endurance. Even in Berlin, reports from the Pacific confirmed a grim symmetry. Wherever the Allies brought radar, concealment ceased to exist. Across continents and oceans, one truth held: the age of darkness in war was over. Radar had made the world visible. It had bound every battlefield from Normandy to New Guinea under a single new law. There was nowhere left to hide. By 1944, the Luftwaffe's night crews flew not with hope, but with habit. Every mission began the same way: shivering men lighting cigarettes in the dark, avoiding each other's eyes, clutching small charms and relics as though they might bend the invisible. Superstition became a form of armor. Some tucked photos under flight gloves. Others whispered coded prayers before takeoff, convinced that luck, not skill, decided survival. In the mess halls they spoke of black beams and magic lights, strange energies the British must have harnessed to hunt them. What they called sorcery was the quiet hum of radar, and it was claiming their comrades faster than flak or fighters ever had. The statistics gave their fear form. By late 1944, more than half of Germany's night bomber crews failed to return from missions. Training schools could no longer keep pace. New pilots entered combat barely competent with instruments, flying straight into the calibrated jaws of the British defense grid. Officers wrote of men trembling at briefings, of aircraft abandoned before takeoff, of nervous breakdowns spreading through entire squadrons. The Luftwaffe's once proud night arm was hollowed from within, undone not by visible fire but by the dread of the unseen. Across the Channel, that same invisibility gave the RAF something the Luftwaffe had lost: certainty. Britain's radar network had evolved from shield to sword, its operators calm and methodical, confident that nothing crossed their screens unseen. The glow of phosphor that terrified one side empowered the other. Darkness itself had changed sides. For the first time in human history, soldiers understood what it meant to be visible without vision, to exist under constant, silent observation. The night had died not by gunfire but by awareness, and the fear it left behind would linger long after the war ended. shaping every conflict fought in the shadows to come. Behind, the glow of the radar screens and the calm voices guiding night fighters through darkness lay an immense and hidden army, an industrial miracle that made the invisible visible. Across Britain, in towns like Malvern, Swanage, Birmingham and Dundee, entire factories were devoted to producing the components that powered the new science of war. Magnetrons, oscilloscopes, cathode ray tubes and transmitter valves were built in shifts that never slept. More than 150,000 engineers, machinists and technicians, many of them women fresh from schools and farms, assembled the delicate circuits and copper waveguides that could detect a bomber 20 miles away through cloud or rain. The hum of lathes and soldering irons replaced the roar of engines. This was the quiet front line of radar. Every working set demanded perfect synchronization. Power grids were rerouted, telephone lines converted into data conduits, and command centers linked by coded teletype to ensure that the pulse of every radar tower matched the rhythm of the system as a whole. The achievement was as much logistical as scientific, a national nervous system woven from copper, glass and discipline. Britain's wartime coordination between scientists, industry and the military, what historian David Edgerton would later call the warfare state, stood in sharp contrast to the chaos inside Germany. There, competing agencies, fragmented research and relentless bombing crippled progress. Each Telefunken laboratory struck, each Siemens facility leveled, meant another blind patch in the Reich's already faltering defense network. By 1944, the numbers spoke for themselves. Allied radar systems on land, sea and air numbered in the tens of thousands, forming an electromagnetic shield that stretched from Newfoundland to Burma. What had begun 8 years earlier as a desperate British experiment in a Suffolk field had grown into a planetary infrastructure of perception. Germany's defeat was no longer measured in territory gained or lost, but in frequencies mastered and wavelengths conquered. When the guns fell silent in 1945, radar stood among the quiet victors of the war, a weapon that had neither a face nor a sound, yet had shaped every battle it touched. It had saved Britain in 1940, guided bomber streams across Europe, guarded convoys on black Atlantic nights and turned the tides of the Pacific. Its triumph was invisible but absolute. When Allied intelligence teams entered captured laboratories at Telefunken and Siemens, German scientists could only marvel at the scale of the system they had fought against. They admitted, often with disbelief, that they had never imagined a network so vast, millions of components, thousands of synchronized stations, and an industrial discipline that had fused science with command. Peace did not end radar's story, so it merely changed its purpose. The same magnetrons that once pulsed through the night sky now powered a new kind of vision. Airports adopted radar for air traffic control. Meteorologists used it to track storms and measure rainfall. Engineers studying signal processing laid the groundwork for early digital computers, while military researchers adapted radar principles into the guidance systems of the first missiles and jet interceptors. What had been born in war became the nervous system of the modern world. Yet the human legacy of radar mattered as deeply as the technical one. Thousands of WWII operators, engineers and pilots had learned to trust not what they saw but what they perceived, bridging instinct and machinery in ways no generation had before. They had learned to read silence as information, light as language, and fear as focus. The Germans, who once cursed radar's unseen eyes, would soon study its methods, feeding the rapid escalation of Cold War detection and surveillance. The machine that ended the night war did more than reveal aircraft in darkness. It opened humanity's first true window into the unseen, a vision that has never slept since. When the last bombers landed and the fires of Europe faded to embers, the night itself had changed forever. No longer did darkness offer concealment or comfort. It had been pierced, measured, and mastered. Radar had taken the ancient mystery of the unseen and turned it into knowledge, transforming fear into foresight. For the Luftwaffe crews who once trusted the stars to hide them, the memory of being found in perfect silence lingered long after the war's end. Every returning echo on a radar scope had been a quiet revelation that there was no such thing as invisibility anymore. Unlike the weapons that thundered and blazed, radar fought its war with light too faint for human eyes. It spoke in pulses, in hums through buried cables and flickers across glass screens. Yet it redefined combat more completely than any bomb or gun. The night sky, once the realm of courage and uncertainty, became the most transparent battlefield mankind had ever known. In the peace that followed, the steel towers along Britain's coast and the radar dishes rising across the world stood like monuments, not to destruction, but to discovery. For the first time in history, victory had come not merely from strength but from understanding. The light that found the dark had done more than win a war. It had forever changed how humanity would see the world and how the world would see itself.